Passing bells for these who die as cattle. Only the monstrous anger of the guns.
George F. Kennan, eminent American diplomat and historian, called it the seminal catastrophe of this century. Perhaps he didn't go quite far enough, for it may well have been the very worst thing to have ever happened. For every legacy of those 4 years, every single one, was poisonous. It has been almost a century since the Great War ended. The horror of the war itself may have faded from living memory, but the wretchedness it engendered is with us still. We lost a world in that war. It was not perfect by any means, but it was brighter and far more hopeful of the future than ours. And if we no longer feel the pain of that loss, as did Hemingway's generation, it is only because we ourselves never knew that bright and forever lost demi-paradise. Some saw it coming and had no illusions about its dreadful potential. One of these was Otto von Bismarck, Germany's Iron Chancellor, and the man most responsible for the unification of Germany under Prussian leadership. He predicted it would begin in the Balkans, a troublesome region where 3 powers, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire, vied for influence with restive locals. Yet despite numerous close calls, Europe's great powers remained at peace for the next 26 years. The summer of 1914 was remembered by contemporaries as being among the most beautiful in memory. Europe was at peace, and for many, but not all by any means, life had never been better, more full of promise. Perhaps it was that idyllic, or perhaps it only seemed so across the darkness that was coming. On 28 June 1914, Gavrilo Princip, a Slav nationalist, with the assistance of radicals within the Serbian government, assassinated the heir presumptive to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife Sophie, Duchess of Hohenberg, in Sarajevo, capital of the Imperial Austro-Hungarian province of Bosnia-Herzegovina. At first, it all seemed just another predicament of the sort that had been managed successfully by the powers in previous years. But European stability had been quietly eroding for years, and as July slipped away and the Europeans dithered, a crisis, unchecked, was gathering a terrible momentum. It was at first, and especially before the great slaughter of the late summer and fall, motivated by a great outpouring of all the good things, the things valued most by these proud people. Then, as the war took on a malevolent life of its own, the motivation to continue sprang more from grief, from the comradeship of shared pain, than from hate. It was a war waged at catastrophic cost, far worse than anyone had imagined, and far worse than any previous war. Death was produced on a vast industrial scale. In little Serbia, where it all started, 1 in 5 of the population lost their lives. No precise accounting of the killed and wounded has ever been made. And how many survived and wish they hadn't? The financial cost was staggering, even by today's standards. The combatants entered the war for various reasons. For Germany, an immensely powerful but curiously insecure nation of energetic and gifted people, a place in the first rank of nations. For Austria-Hungary, the elimination of the pan-Slav threat represented by Serbia. For France, vengeance for the humiliation of defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. For Russia, solidarity with their little Slavic brothers in Serbia, and quite possibly access to the Mediterranean. The United Kingdom, still mostly on top of things in the world but starting to fade, wished to preserve the status quo. The tottering Ottoman Empire simply wanted to survive. Italy wanted to grab nice bits of Austria-Hungary. The rising power in the East sought respect from the white powers. And finally, Woodrow Wilson told us we were fighting to make the world safe for democracy, to end war permanently. Those objectives without a red X were the ones achieved. In every way, the Great War is the supreme historical exemplar of the law of unintended consequences. It went wrong for everybody from the start. It is making things go wrong for us to this day. Let's do a quick review of the war itself before we get into its effects. First, the sides. The nations in pink, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey, constituted the Central Powers, while the countries in green, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, Italy, and others, including later the United States, were the Allied powers. The countries in tan remained neutral. The great question of who was to blame for the war has, despite a century of debate, never been resolved to everyone's satisfaction, and remains an open question, at least to historians. This one thing, however, is certain. Of all the powers involved, only the leaders of the German Empire were absolutely in a position to prevent a general war from starting in the first place, and in one of history's most dreadful miscalculations, and it was calculated, they simply decided not to. The fighting starts in August 1914 with Germany attacking France through Belgium, France attacking Germany all along the frontier, and Russia attacking Germany in East Prussia. All the attacks, each planned as a war winner, failed at terrible, stunning cost. Stalemate set in. In 1915, Germany made her main effort in the East to save her faltering ally, Austria-Hungary, which was being roughly handled by the Russians. In the West, with offensive action limited by a lack of trained reserves and artillery ammunition, operations were not decisive, merely bloody. February 1916 saw the Germans on the offensive again against the French at a place called Verdun. Their plan was not subtle. They would keep attacking until the French ran out of soldiers. The battle lasted until December, at terrible cost to both sides. To the north along the Somme River, Britain's new army of volunteers, the UK was alone among the great European powers in not having conscription, attacked the Germans in what their commander, General Douglas Haig, was confident would be the decisive engagement of the war. He was wrong. He would continue to be wrong at horrific cost. Meanwhile, Russia was becoming exhausted and demoralized. In 1917, the carnage continued on all fronts. After another bloody and fruitless offensive, large portions of the French army went, for all effective purposes, on strike. They would hold their trenches, but they would not attack. Eventually, a new commander and new policies mostly corrected the situation, but clearly France too was becoming exhausted. In February, the Tsar abdicated. Russia stayed in the war after a fashion until October, when the provisional government was swept away by the Bolsheviks. The Germans knew, with America in the war since April 1917, that sooner or later, with the largest economy in the world and a huge reserve of manpower, the United States would make herself felt decisively. General Ludendorff, for all intents and purposes Germany's military dictator, decided to stake everything on one final vast offensive, using the forces freed from the East after concluding a very harsh treaty with a desperate Lenin. It very nearly succeeded. It was stopped by the British and the French with some American help. What was decisive, however, was the fact that Americans were pouring into France in huge numbers, brimming with a health and enthusiasm that was a tonic to the Allies and toxic to German morale. By November, it was all over. The war was more or less localized into what were called fronts. The most prominent, and certainly the most lethal, was the Western Front. It ran from the North Sea at the westernmost tip of Belgium, across northeast France to the Swiss border. The War of Movement in August and September 1914 congealed that fall into a continuous line of trench works that remained mostly static until 1918, when a war of movement resumed, first with the German offensive operations, then the Allied counterstrokes. The Eastern Front ran from the Baltic Sea to the border of Romania. Here, German and Austro-Hungarian forces fought Russians. It was much less dense, not a continuous occupied line, and more fluid than the Western Front. The Italians entered the war on the Allied side in early 1915, hoping to grab some Austrian territory. The fighting occurred in mountainous terrain along the Isonzo River in the northeast, and it too was mostly static, very bloody, and entirely fruitless. Serbia was crushed by the Central Powers in a brutal campaign in late 1915. There were several other minor theaters or operations, to include Gallipoli, a failed attempt by the Allies to knock Turkey out of the war and open a supply route to Russia, Salonika in Greece, where the Allies landed troops to aid the Serbs, another failure, and not shown the Sinai, Palestine, and Iraq, where the British and Commonwealth forces faced Turks, and the Pacific Theater, which largely consisted of various Japanese operations to seize German territories. The immediate after effects of the war were the end of three national dynasties, the Hohenzollerns in Germany as that nation became the Weimar Republic, the Habsburgs in Austria-Hungary as the dual monarchy literally fell apart, and the end of the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty in Russia as that benighted land agonizingly morphed into the Soviet Union. The Turkish Ottoman Empire was broken up and mostly shared between the UK and France. Europe was spent, physically and morally, and America's enthusiasm turned to disappointment, and she turned inward. This is how Central Europe looked before and after the war. The red lines on the map at right show the borders in 1919, while the white lines show them today. The Ottoman lands were divided between the British, shown in blue at right, and the French, shown in purple. The borders established in 1922 remained in effect until 1948 and the establishment of the State of Israel. The war had ended with an armistice in November 1918. The victorious Allies soon thereafter met to work out a final treaty in France. The negotiations were long, difficult, and murky. The Germans were not permitted to participate, but were made to sign the Treaty of Versailles as it was and without appeal in June 1919. The treaty did several things, all bad from their perspective. First, and in some ways worst of all, they were blamed for starting the war, as debatable a proposition then as it remains now. They were made to pay huge reparations to the victorious Allies to cover the cost of the war they had purportedly started. Germany was made to disarm almost completely. This was quite a blow to a nation which was, to quote an English journalist, not a country with an army, but an army with a country, such being the military's esteem. And Germany was made to give up some territory, beginning of course with the lost French provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. The treaty was harsh, but not nearly as harsh as the one imposed by the victorious Germans on the Russians in 1918. Nonetheless, it was greeted with general dismay. Almost immediately, the idea that the valiant German army had not been beaten, but rather had been betrayed, stabbed in the back, by socialists and Jews back home gained much traction. This popular notion was to cause much mischief. Austria-Hungary became Austria and Hungary, and each was required to sign a separate peace settlement. Austria signed the Treaty of Saint-Germain, Hungary signed the Treaty of Trianon. That separation became fact when the treaties were signed. They too were saddled with blame for the war and made to pay reparations. Both lost territory, out of which the new states of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia were created. Additional territory was ceded to Poland, Romania, and Italy. Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire to be precise, had to sign the Treaty of Sèvres. This was the most severe of all the post-war treaties. Why? We can't be certain, but Turkey's defeat of the Allies at Gallipoli in 1915 rankled deeply, and worse, Turkey's genocidal treatment of its Armenian minority had horrified the world. Turkey proper was reduced to its present borders. Access between the Mediterranean and Black Sea was controlled by the League of Nations, created as part of the Treaty of Versailles. And, as we have seen, the Turkish Arab lands were turned over to France and Britain to be managed as caretaker mandates. And for a short time, until the Young Turk Revolt led by Kemal Ataturk, the British and French controlled internal and external Turkish policies. So much for short-term consequences. Now some longer-term effects, divided into these categories. At first, those consequences related more or less to technology. Everyone is familiar with these. Technology increased our ability to kill one another exponentially. Machine guns firing at rates of up to 600 rounds per minute, and heavy artillery delivering long-range indirect fires quickly destroyed the romantic nonsense that willpower and gallantry alone could win battles. And barbed wire, invented in America for cattle ranchers, may have been the simplest but most decisive innovation of all. Laid in dense lines, it was immune to artillery fire and could stop an infantry attack in its tracks, leaving the attackers at the mercy of the machine gunners, who were deeply hated, and the artillerymen. These too are familiar, and all, much improved, save poison gas, would be decisive when the Great War resumed 21 years later in 1939. One technology, in its infancy at the time, was missing from the battlefields of Europe, this being reliable wireless tactical communications, two-way radios. Its absence, though underappreciated for a time by historians, was truly decisive. The Industrial Revolution and the modern nation-state allowed for the fielding of armies vastly larger than in past wars. It was no longer possible for senior commanders to view and thereby control entire battlefields. They were just too large. In the absence of radio communications, command and control were accomplished through the use of wired telephone networks and couriers. Once battle was joined, however, these methods quickly failed. Telephone wires were cut by artillery, and couriers seldom survived long enough to deliver their messages. As the commander could not see what was happening and could not communicate with his subordinates in contact with the enemy, he could do little to effectively influence the battle. He was blind, deaf, and dumb. By the same token, his subordinate commanders could not report their situations or request assistance. In essence, battles could not be controlled once they began. This meant that they had to be planned out in detail beforehand and then executed in lockstep. There is an old military maxim that states that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. You can imagine how these planned battles went. Imagine trying to play a game of chess from a move-by-move plan you worked out in advance. This inability to dynamically control the battlefield, insofar as this is possible at all, was, along with the lethality of defense weaponry like the machine gun, largely responsible for the terrible slaughter that was Great War combat. Great strides were made in the evacuation and treatment of the wounded. All combatants adopted the system known as triage, developed by the French, which classified wounded according to urgency and the likelihood of treatment being successful, the last category being reserved for the hopeless. An evacuation system, beginning with forward aid stations, progressing rearward through several echelons of increasingly specialized treatment facilities to large hospitals in the home country, provided fairly comprehensive care, the aim of which was, of course, to heal the patient sufficiently for him to be returned to the front as quickly as possible. At first, the British classified psychological casualties as LMF, meaning lack of moral fiber. As the horror of trench warfare produced large numbers of what would later be called shell-shocked men, even the British had to admit that simple cowardice did not suffice to explain the phenomenon. Treatment was simply to remove such casualties from the front, give them rest and good food, and hope for the best. We're not really all that much improved today. A jagged piece of shell tearing into a soldier's face, if not killing him outright, would usually leave him hideously disfigured. Efforts to repair or at least hide such wounds saw the start of the practice of plastic surgery. The French in particular were pioneers in this work. The rapid advances in weapons technology during the Great War came about as the result of a big new idea, a consortium of national governments, industries, the sciences, and the military combining and coordinating their efforts to conceive, develop, fund, and produce war-winning weapon systems, and operating outside any outside influences or system of checks and balances. These were the first military-industrial complexes, but of course not the last. The 20th century saw weapons developed and fielded at astronomical cost, and the nations, even exceptional nations, did not hesitate to use them in pursuit of victory at any cost. On 15 October 1915, an English nurse working in Belgium named Edith Cavell was executed by a German firing squad. It had all been very legal. She had been convicted by a military court of aiding and abetting the enemy, an infraction to which she confessed. Her punishment may have been strictly legal, but it was also boneheaded in a way in which the Germans were masters. It was yet another public relations disaster for the clueless Teutons, who, after only a few weeks of war, had shot hundreds of innocent Belgian civilians and burned down the library in Louvain, destroying one of the world's priceless collections of ancient texts. In May of 1915, they torpedoed and sank the Lusitania, killing over 1,000 civilian passengers, including over 100 Americans. For a people who treasured their sophisticated culture, the Germans had, all by themselves, made themselves the Hun, and the Allies, particularly the British, were quick to capitalize. The Great War saw the emerging technology of media put to use to motivate the warring populations to support the war efforts. German atrocities were grist for the mill, with both print and film being used to portray the Germans as other than human, other being the operative word here, other than us, other than moral, other than human. Therefore, worthy of hate, worthy of death. Allied propaganda, capitalizing on German brutality, tended to be lurid, and after the real German atrocities had been exploited, was often based on unsubstantiated reports or invented from whole cloth. The Germans sometimes behaved badly, sometimes very badly, but were never as truly awful as they were depicted by the propagandists. After the war, there was considerable anger directed at these fabrications, which served to thoroughly discredit the whole notion of propaganda. So much so that in the next war, when reports of widespread, horrific German atrocities emerged from occupied Europe, it was difficult to convince people that these reports were true, and not just more false propaganda. German propagandists were never as sophisticated as the Allies. Their efforts tended to focus on patriotism or sloppy sentimentalism. The Germans deeply resented the way they were depicted in Allied propaganda, but their attempts at refutation were clumsy and ineffective. Bolshevik and later Soviet propaganda focused on the basic themes of the revolution and their ideology, rather than on their exterior enemies, which were legion. Also, it tended to be far and away the most artistic, often quite striking. In this section, we'll concern ourselves with policy. The Great War saw the perfection of the notion of total war, a simple idea that means essentially that unrestricted war is to be waged not only against the military forces of the enemy, but against the enemy state itself, to include all its interests and assets, including its civilian population. It is characterized by several features. Total central control of the nation-state, mobilized and directed toward a single aim, victory. A subordination of respect for international law, also for the sake of victory. Bettman Hollweg's famous utterance is the perfect exemplar. Total war includes a lack of tolerance for dissent of any kind, often involving a curtailment of the freedoms of speech and assembly, as a minimum. In the United States, under the Sedition Act of 1918, it became a federal crime to engage in speech, public or private, denigrating the war effort. Eugene Debs, leader of the American Socialist Party, was jailed when he objected to U.S. participation. The desire for victory at any cost led to direct attacks on civilian populations, on land and sea, and in some places, very harsh treatment of civilians caught up in the battle areas, such as in Belgium in 1914 and in Poland and Galicia. Another of the Great War's poison fruits was the policy which came to be known as genocide. Specifically, the Armenian genocide, carried out by the Ottoman Turks and their Arab subjects against the Christian Armenian minority between 1915 and 1923. The Armenians were ethnically and religiously distinct from the majority Turks. They also tended to be better educated and more prosperous. This made them unpopular, and they had always been so. Some few Turkish Armenians actively sided with the Russians, fellow Christians, when Turkey entered the war as part of the Central Powers, accompanying the invading Russians in the Caucasus. The Ottomans, after suffering several humiliating defeats and convinced they were fighting for their very survival, reacted vigorously. Harsh measures designed to deal with the Armenian problem once and for all were authorized by what has come to be known as the Tekir Law, passed by the Ottoman Parliament on 27 May 1915, authorizing the deportation of the Ottoman Empire's Armenian population. This served to legitimize what had already started. The net result was a catastrophe, or to use perhaps a more meaningful term, Holocaust. Whether or not genocide has happened or is happening can be hard to determine. Turkey denies that what happened in the Great War and thereafter was genocide, based on the contention that it does not meet the definition. Go to Wikipedia. You'll find at last count 26 authoritative definitions. These three conditions are present in the majority of those definitions. As regards the Armenians, number one was clearly present. The Tekir Law legitimized the activities of the Turkish authorities, at least in their eyes. But it contained no language specifically directing that the Armenians be eliminated or killed. In fact, it speaks mostly of resettlement, a term that will take on ominous meaning in 1942. Was it genocide? You decide. The Turks set the precedent of identifying and destroying an unwanted minority as a matter of state policy. They would be followed by others. Another political legacy of the Great War was the peculiar relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. Communism, and most particularly its extreme and inauthentic manifestation in Russia as Bolshevism, was absolute anathema to the West, and this was particularly true in enthusiastically capitalist America, then as now a sort of hybrid democracy-plutocracy. The subsequent intervention by the West on the side of the reactionary white forces in the Russian Civil War had a profound negative effect on the Bolshevik leadership, particularly on Lenin. Our alliance with the Soviet Union in World War II was almost certainly necessary to defeat the Germans, but it was always uneasy and very unnatural. The Cold War set in very quickly after victory over Nazi Germany, and we should consider ourselves extremely lucky that it remained cold. When the Soviet Union collapsed, starting in 1989, a proud people were humbled. We could have behaved better than we did. The result? We have had to endure 100 years of a toxic relationship with a nation that was, after all, just another bastard offspring of the Great War. The United States became the world's largest economy sometime between 1870 and 1900. However, at the start of the Great War, the United Kingdom was still the center of world finance and banking. By war's end, the center had shifted somewhat to the west. Both the UK and France had financed their war largely with loans from the US. Hence, US banks held much debt. This was not such a good thing, because the US banking system was not nearly as stable as the UK's. Sometimes economics and politics work at cross purposes, and when you throw in bad luck, the results can be unfortunate in the extreme. The players in this post-Great War drama were the Weimar Republic, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, and the United States, between 1920 and 1933. We start with a defeated Germany in dire straits in 1920, plagued by political unrest and hyperinflation. A number of radical groups on both right and left coalesced into small political parties. Former soldier Adolf Hitler joins one of them in Munich and shows a real talent for leadership. For its part, the United States emerges from the war stronger than ever, but has become disillusioned by events in Europe. France is at loggerheads with Germany over the latter's inability to pay reparations stipulated by the Treaty of Versailles. The U.S., whose economy is booming, decides to provide Germany with huge loans under the Dawes Plan, allowing them to pay the reparations and jump-start their economy. It works brilliantly. In the meantime, Corporal Hitler has gained control of the Nazi Party and attempts to seize control of Munich by means of a coup. It fails and he is jailed, finding time thereby to write his manifesto, Mein Kampf. Hitler is released after only 9 months and, eschewing another coup attempt, works within the Weimar Republic's political system to gain power. However, because the economy in Germany is now relatively healthy as a result of the U.S. loans, the party has little appeal and does poorly in the elections of 1928. Most observers count the Nazis out. Here's where the bad luck comes in. In late 1929, the U.S. stock market has a major downward correction that develops into what will be called the Great Depression. The loans to Germany are called. Of course, the Germans can't pay, and their economy collapses again. Moving forward to the early 30s, the U.S. fiscal response to the crisis is botched, and the fragile U.S. banking system collapses. America turns even more inward. Germany's crisis deepens while the ineffective Weimar government dithers. The middle class is wiped out. Again. The German people are frightened. Unemployment has risen to 30%. This has all been manna from heaven for the Nazis. His party captures the most seats in the Reichstag in the election of July 1932, and after months of political chaos and infighting, he is named Chancellor in January 1933 by President von Hindenburg. In March, Hitler engineers the destruction of Germany's parliament building and uses the event as an excuse to crack down on his political enemies. In March, in its very last act, the Nazi-controlled parliament passes an enabling act, voting itself out of existence and granting Hitler full power. It is the end of the Weimar Republic and the beginning of the end for Germany. This was Germany's response to the Depression. In the United States, despite fears of revolution, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is elected in 1932 and addresses the problems of the Depression peacefully and democratically. Here we'll look at some of the Great War's effects on specific populations and nationalities. Large numbers of women entered the workforce during the war for mostly two reasons. One, they were very much needed to replace men who had been taken into the forces. And two, they were patriotically motivated to make a contribution to the war effort. They proved, to no one's surprise, save the testosterone-addled, that women could do the job of any man and often could do it better. After the war, however, with the men returning, the women went home and resumed their normal roles. This would happen all over again between 1939 and 1945, with much the same result. It would, in fact, not be until much later in the century that women would permanently and decisively enter the workforce. The momentum developed by the women's suffrage movement in the UK and the US remained intact during the war, despite or perhaps because of the fact that most of the pre-war militancy of the activists was put on hold, most of whom, including Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughter Christabel, supported the war effort. In the UK, the 1918 Representation of the People Act effectively granted the vote to women on the same basis as men, that is, on the basis of property. In the US, the 19th Amendment was passed, granting women the vote in 1920. It had long been assumed that suffrage was granted as a result of gratitude to women for their important contributions to the war effort. This idea has been revised by historians of late and replaced by more nuanced explanations. For example, that suffrage was an inevitable consequence of progressive movements in both countries. Women's role in the culture changed during the war, but probably not as much as we like to think. Many did, for a time at least, escape the rigid confines of domesticity, and women's fashions adapted to the practicalities of wartime, at least a bit. Women did not, however, all cut their hair short and become flappers, though the experience of work or service did begin to change the way women saw themselves in the culture, and imparted to many the notion that they did indeed have rights that should be respected. The Great War had a very definite effect on African Americans. To suggest, however, that the effects were positive is problematical. Burgeoning war industries generated tremendous demand for workers, and huge numbers of African Americans moved out of the South to take relatively well-paying jobs in these industries. When the war ended, they mostly remained in place. Large numbers volunteered for or were conscripted into the military, a military that was completely segregated and tended to relegate persons of color to menial duties. Notwithstanding, 2 infantry divisions were created and manned exclusively by black Americans, who made up the enlisted, non-commissioned, and junior officer ranks, but who were commanded by white senior officers. Within the U.S. Army, both units had indifferent to bad reputations, at the time unofficially attributed to racial inferiority, but publicly ascribed to insufficient training and poor leadership on the part of their white commanders. Significantly, when elements of these units were committed to battle under French leadership alongside French soldiers, they performed admirably and were much praised by the French for their bravery and zeal. After the war, the African American soldiers returned home proud of their service and naively burdened with the hope that appreciation for such service would improve their status. They were soon disabused of any such notions. The Ku Klux Klan enjoyed a renaissance, and the number of lynchings increased alarmingly. In the South, nothing had changed. Turkey's decision to join the Central Powers in 1915 did not, as it turned out, work out to their complete satisfaction. At the time, the Ottoman Empire controlled the Middle East, including the Sinai, Palestine, the oil-rich Fertile Crescent, and most of the Arabian Peninsula. It was to lose everything. These areas were populated by an extremely diverse collection of peoples and cultures, from nomadic Bedouins whose lives had changed little from the time they rode for the Prophet, carrying the banner of Islam to much of the world, to sophisticated city dwellers with modern or modernizing economies. To the former went T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence was a flamboyant and literate Oxford-educated archaeologist, commissioned in the British Army at the start of the Great War and sent as liaison to the Arabs of the Ottoman Empire. His mission was, insofar as was possible, to coordinate with Faisal's Arab forces, who were then in revolt against their Ottoman overlords. In this he was remarkably successful. He became a passionate advocate for Arab independence, thereby raising Arab hopes in this regard, sadly somewhat unrealistically. The so-called Sykes-Picot Agreement effectively divided the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire outside the Arabian Peninsula into areas of future British and French control or influence. The terms were negotiated by the French diplomat François-Georges Picot and Britain Sir Mark Sykes without consultation with the affected peoples. The Russian Tsarist government was a minor party to the agreement, and when, following the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks exposed its provisions, to quote a contemporary British journalist, the British were embarrassed, the Arabs dismayed, and the Turks delighted. The problem was that the Arab aspirations encouraged by Lawrence and others did not match the realities of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. There was, to say the least, much disappointment. To further muddy the waters, on the 2nd of November 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, in an attempt to garner domestic Jewish support, sent a letter to Baron Walter Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community, for transmission to the Zionist Federation of Great Britain and Ireland. In that letter he stated that the British government would support the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. This sentiment was later incorporated into the peace treaty with the Ottoman Empire at the end of the war and the Mandate for Palestine, which legitimized the British caretaker governance of that region. Needless to say, Mr. Balfour did not consult the Palestinians before posting his letter. And that, of course, was the crux of the problem. In defense of these gentlemen imperialists, however, it must be said that given the complexity of the region and the contentiousness of its inhabitants, it is unlikely that anyone today could have or would have done any better. Recent history would seem to bear this out. The net result? Another tragic legacy of the Great War. Now we'll look at the cultural consequences. There exists a great cultural gulf between the world of 1914 and the world after the Great Dying. To illustrate a few of the differences between eras, we go from the ideal, charming, forward-looking, optimistic, witty, and urbane Gibson girl to the brash, hard-drinking, hard-edged, and hard-living flapper. We go from the optimistic philosophy of pragmatism, as espoused by William James, to the bleak, nihilistic gloom of Oswald Spengler and his Decline of the West. In poetry, we leave behind the lilting and hopeful paean to immortality of Tennyson's The Brook for T.S. Eliot's hopeless wasteland, I will show you fear in a handful of dust. No modern poet would dare write as Tennyson and his lesser contemporaries did. The very air they breathed was different. In art, we scorn the ephemeral loveliness of the pre-Raphaelites and of Tissot, and embrace the soiled urinals of the datists, inspired by the horrors of the Great War. In architecture, we turned our backs on nature as inspiration for such wonders as the charming and fantastical, if impractical, designs of Victor Horta, and turned to the Teutonic practicality and angularity of the Bauhaus school, which inspired such treasures as the endless gray tower blocks of Moscow or grim Cabrini Green. In short, what the Great War did was destroy the confidence in beauty, goodness, and progress of La Belle Epoque, to be replaced by the angst and moral ennui of W. H. Auden's Age of Anxiety. Here is a recent quote from Joachim Gauck, President of Germany. His statement, "Europe, its partner, is busy navel-gazing," speaks to Europe's lack of any firm commitment to a policy, or the formulation of any policy for that matter, in response to the alarming developments in the Middle East and elsewhere. Europe is, again, for all its potential power and influence, hanging back, cautious, afraid to act, afraid of getting it wrong. On a personal note, in my military career, I worked often with our NATO partners. Back in the 80s, we were all focused, as we had been for years, on the threat of an attack by the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact on Central Europe. As I participated in staff work with Europeans, I always had the vague sense that their hearts were not really in it. I often wondered, if it came to war, would they really be there in it with us? We all knew in the event of an attack, the great disparity in conventional forces would, in all likelihood, force the West to resort to the nuclear option at some point. Our war games always ended abruptly when the NATO commander requested permission to use tactical nuclear weapons. No one wanted to talk about, or plan, what would happen after that, or what we could do as an alliance to avoid having to face that Hobson's choice. It was all apparently too much, or too hard to think about. In hindsight, I came to realize that the whole business of planning for a war we all hoped and prayed would never come, was infused with a kind of melancholy. A melancholy that sprang from a source far deeper and more ancient than the immediate specter of a possible nuclear war. There, at Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, Headquarters Shape, in Mons, Belgium, our problem was ghosts. They were the ghosts of the men of the British Expeditionary Force and the German First Army, who had clashed right there at Mons on the 23rd of August 1914, in one of the opening engagements of the Great War. These were the ghosts of our grandfathers, who had bravely, but blindly, marched into a calamity for them, a calamity for the millions who would follow, with a pause, right into 1945, and possibly, if we could not somehow keep the peace, a calamity for us. An event of great agony is bearable only in the belief that it will bring about a better world. When it does not, disillusion is deep and moves on to self-doubt and self-disgust. Barbara Tuchman, in her great work, A Distant Mirror, though she was speaking of the 14th century in this quote, perfectly summed up what happened in the minds and hearts of the generation of the Great War. Ernest Hemingway gave the name to that generation in epigraph 1 of his novel, The Sun Also Rises. When Gertrude Stein spoke of a lost generation, she was speaking of young men she knew in Paris, Frenchmen, Americans, Brits, Poles, who had survived the war physically intact, but had been permanently altered by it, and seldom for the better. The Allied victory had been bought at terrible cost. On the 14th of July, 1919, Bastille Day, right after the Germans had been made to sign the Treaty of Versailles, the French held a great victory parade along the Champs-Élysées, the marchers passing beneath the Arc de Triomphe for the first time since France's humiliating defeat at the hands of the Germans in the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. I will read a passage from Alistair Horn's book about the defeat of France in 1940 to lose a battle. It is a description of that victory parade in Paris in 1919. But those who led the way across the threshold in this historic moment, they were not Joffre or Foch, not the cavalry or the Zouaves or any Allied detachment. They were three young men, or what remained of them, unspeakably crippled by war, still in uniform, but trundled by their nurses in primitive chariots like the prams of deprived children. Immediately behind them came a large contingent of more grands mutiles, officers and men of all ranks, mixed together, many already in mufti. They marched, or hobbled, without precedence or any semblance of military order, 12 abreast. Hardly one had not lost an eye or a limb, and many bore on their chests France's most coveted decoration, the Médaille Militaire. The totally blind, some accorded the privilege of being ensign-bearers, came led by the one-legged or the armless men with their destroyed faces mercifully hidden behind bandages, men with no hands, men with their complexions still tinted green from the effects of chlorine, men with mad eyes staring out from beneath the skull caps which concealed some appalling head injury. With a painful, halting pace, the column moved by, down the Champs-Élysées to the stands specially set apart for them. As they passed, a stand filled with 150 young Alsatian girls in national costume, flowers rained down upon them. For a brief moment the terrible spectacle of the broken men was met with a kind of stunned silence. Then an immense cry, which seemed to spring from the very entrails of the race, arose from the vast crowd, a cry which was both a salute and pledge. No one who watched the mutilés pass that day could be unaware of what they represented, of the many thousands more hopelessly maimed, lodged in hospitals across the country which they would never leave, of the hundreds of thousands of other war casualties, only relatively more fortunate, to whom the future could hardly offer much, and who in turn would be able to contribute but little toward the reconstruction of their exhausted nation. But above all, of the lost legions, men who had not returned at all from the martyrdom of the Western Front, either whole or crippled. From metropolitan France alone, these numbered 1,315,000, or 27% of all men between the ages of 18 and 27. No combatant nation except for little Serbia had a higher mortality rate, higher than Russia, higher than Germany or her allies. It was a fact which, so brutally brought home on this luminous day of victory celebrations, would never cease to haunt the nation. The battlefield at Verdun is one of the most haunting places on earth. Its undulating landscape resembles no other, created by a storm of shells that seldom ceased to fall from February to December 1916. The several villages here were literally ground to powder. The French government attempted to reclaim the land for agriculture after the war. It could not be done. Unexploded munitions made the land deadly. It is deadly still, and haunted. Here was the epicenter of France's great agony. The place was chosen by General von Falkenhayn, chief of the German General Staff, as a place the French could not afford to lose, a place they would fight to keep, a place where France would be bled white. The general was correct on all counts. The French held on under the rallying cry, "On ne passe pas." They shall not pass. The Germans didn't pass, but were bled white trying. An area about the size of Central Park was fought over for 8 months. Imagine an Antietam that lasts not one day, but goes on day after day for months on end. As divisions were destroyed, both sides fed in more. The French along a single road into the battle area, the Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way. In time, most of the French army made its doleful way along that route, an entire generation of young Frenchmen made to serve time in hell. Those who survived, and almost 1 million men were killed or wounded, did not forget. Towering over the battlefield today is the Great Ossuary, a Gothic structure erected in 1932 as a memorial to all soldiers, French, German, American, and other nationalities, who fell in this battle. In the cellar of this structure are interred the remains of 130,000 unidentified soldiers collected from the battlefield. The French are still finding and adding remains to this collection to this day. Psychologically, the Great Ossuary towered not just above a battlefield, but above France itself. And as Germany rearmed and Hitler fomented and plotted, it became ever more obvious to those who could bear to think about it that the horror of 1914-1918 was about to be resumed. Yet, in the shadow of that great tower, and all that it meant to a nation that had been wounded to its very core, few could bear to think about it, and France did nothing. Great Britain's agony had been on the Somme, and around a small textile center in Flanders called Ypres, or Wipers, as the Tommies pronounced it. On the Somme, on the first day of July 1916, 20,000 young men of Lord Kitchener's new army were consumed in a morning. These were the young men who had flocked to the colors in 1914, England's very best and brightest. Many more would give their lives in the months that followed. The fighting petered out in November after claiming over 1 million casualties and changing the strategic situation not a whit. The Germans, as determined to hold here as were the French at Verdun, fought desperately, suffering almost as many killed and wounded as their attackers. To the north, 3 terrible battles were fought in the tabletop flat country around Ypres. The last, contested near the beautifully named town of Passchendaele, from which it took its name, was fought against the wishes of the British government, having grown weary of the huge losses for little gain associated with Field Marshal Haig's offensives. They would like to have replaced him, but knew of no one who could do any better. Passchendaele was another meat grinder, made all the more horrible by incessant fall rains, which filled shell holes into which wounded men tumbled, slowly drowning, their cries for help unanswerable by comrades for whom any attempt at rescue was suicide. England's War Graves Commission, the best organized of all the combatants, erected the Minongate Memorial at Ypres after the war. In its large hall of memory are stone panels containing the names of most of the 54,896 Commonwealth soldiers who died in nearby fighting, but whose bodies have never been identified or recovered. It is a very sobering experience to view the towering walls and tablets, every inch filled with the names of young men who were simply swallowed up by the surrounding countryside. Pilgrimages to Minongate and the other monuments erected by the British and Commonwealth people remain popular to this day, and on Remembrance Day in November, many can still be seen wearing a red poppy. As did France's great ossuary at Verdun, Minongate weighed on the minds of Britain's leaders as they watched with alarm the developments in Germany, and despite the best efforts of men like Winston Churchill, they too did mostly nothing. America was spared a Verdun or a Somme. We simply weren't in the war long enough. Our one great operation, the Argonne Offensive, was terrible enough. Our inexperienced troops threw themselves into the fray with a reckless enthusiasm our allies and the enemy hadn't seen since 1914. The veteran Germans mowed them down as they attacked in dense masses. That too was just like 1914. But the doughboys kept coming and won a convincing victory. Our real strategic contribution to Allied victory was that naive enthusiasm, and of course our great numbers, both of which so buoyed our allies and discouraged the Germans. But the war ended and the enthusiasm turned to disappointment, and in some people cynicism and deep suspicion. To many Americans, the Great War, and particularly our participation, had been a great mistake. Many of us, even some of our heroes, wanted nothing to do with Europe and its endless troubles. In deeply troubled Germany, an intact army marched home to a country that hadn't lost an inch of territory to Allied offensive action. The defeat did not seem real, yet the Treaty of Versailles with its harsh provisions was real enough, and so was the threat of insurrection from both right and left. Where the economies of England and France were strained to the limit, the German economy simply collapsed. Hyperinflation rendered worthless Europe's strongest currency. Worst of all, however, was the great void left in German hearts by the legions of bright young men who would never come home, and those who would never be whole. It hurt. The fact that it had all been for nothing made it hurt all the more.